Welcome to CDMO Career Stories, part of the Metric Podcast Network. The careers that shape the CDMO and biopharma industry rarely follow a straight line. This show is about the people behind them. Every episode, we sit down with senior leaders and commercial practitioners to talk about the decisions that define them, how they build and lead high-performing teams, how they win business, and where the talent landscape is heading next. We're here in New York on day one of DCAT 2026. I'm joined by Nigel Walker, founder and CEO of That's Nice and best dressed man in the industry. Nigel, for those that aren't aware and perhaps don't know you, introduce yourself and what you do.
That's very kind, Sam. So, yes, thank you for inviting us here. Obviously, DCAT 2026. Nigel Walker, founder of That's Nice. Yes, occasionally called CEO. I think the journey and that maybe the moment of when you realise that you're in a space and you actually can see younger companies like your business at Metric Bio, and let's say older companies and more mature businesses like the big pharma, and being able to actually associate with both of those, that's really the joining together of what DCAT's all about. But again, thanks. Looking forward to having the conversation, and let's get straight into it.
Sure, no, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. I know you've got a busy week. I guess for you and the purpose of this is to get to the crux of people's stories and understanding people and their journeys. So for you, how did you get into the CDMO industry and how did you get into agency?
Yeah, it goes back obviously all the way to 1995, but actually first won a painting competition. So for some of you out there that have no clue that I was actually originally a fine artist, going all the way back to 92, I won a painting competition at the London College of Printing, which is now the London College of the Arts in Elephant and Castle. And the prize was a 17-week tuition, free room and board, and a small stipend for food to study at FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology. So there is a little bit of a full circle coming around to fashion. So I got into the graphic design advertising program there for 17 weeks, and I was just completely excited about New York City. I mean, I was from a small village of about 1,200 people after we'd originally moved from the Birmingham area. Go Aston Villa, up the Villa. And when I moved over to the United States, it was just, I was like, this is the place for me. The business started about 3 years later, and we actually originally started in New York City signage. So we actually designed the first signage system, the non-vehicular, so pedestrian, cyclist and rollerblading system in New York City. And there's now about 55,000 signs that circumvent the whole of New York City. So that was the very first customer, New York City EDC. Nothing to do with pharma, nothing to do with obviously CDMO. Our first pharma customer was actually Allied Signal. And Allied Signal was into monomers and polymers and wicking fibers, wicking fabrics. But they also had a simulated moving bed facility in Arklow Island, which is actually now a Servier facility. Rolling that clock back forward 20 years, we actually repositioned Servier CDMO. So our very first business was with Allied Signal, and it was in monomers and polymers, which is in fact in material science, so not life science.
Okay.
Do you know that story?
I didn't know that story. No. So for you then, at what point did you look to narrow that focus? What made you sort of dive into the CDMO industry and ultimately get to the point where you are now so well known and so kind of widely used within the CDMO industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know if you've ever been to a polymer facility, but there's something called prill, and it's just a mountain of polymer, whether it's a monomer or a polymer. And there was about 100 ton of prill in a facility. And just the other side, the glass in a lab was a kilo of API. And the kilo of API is more valuable than the 100 ton of prill. So that's actually where we transitioned. We transitioned through the glass, as I like to say, and into material science. So that was with an API. And obviously you know that there's APIs right now. A kilo of API could be $1,000 or it could be up to $10 or $15 million. So that's in chemistry. So we started out in the chemical synthesis as we moved out of material science into life science. And as you know now, we've moved all the way through to advanced therapeutics with CAR natural killer cells for for one of our clients, Inceptor Bio. So it really actually started out in polymers, moved into high-value, high-potent APIs, and then obviously all the way now into cancer-curing drugs for gene and cell therapy.
And I get, so to go back to your point in terms of your sort of origin story and the sort of art background and how that ultimately led to you getting into agency, that transition to a very science-led technical market is a pretty lengthy one. Yeah. So was there a particular moment at which you thought, I'm going to dive into the science here and really sort of learn about the subject?
Yeah, so my business partner and actually co-founder, Mark Allen, used to be a professional golfer, PGA golfer, but he's a great individual with the communication of obviously the word. So when you're talking about language and you're talking about science, Mark and I are not scientists, but we've read a huge amount on science. So actually the very first PhD that we hired was from MIT, a gentleman called Victor Coker. And he came on board having graduated from MIT, and he did a small slot at Pyramid Health Sciences. And we really realized that what we were doing, we were missing the game. So yes, I think we're able to create the brand, we're able to tell the story, but what we needed was the in-depth underlying vision of why that CDMO is in business. And also remember, the term CDMO really didn't come around until around 2010. So it used to be called outsourcing, and then it became contract manufacturing organizations. And then around 2010, they threw in the word D. And occasionally for our Indian conglomerates, they like to throw in the CRDMO business, and that's the research component as well. So started there from Victor. We understood that science was really critical. Now you take a look at the staff that we have at That's Nice, and we have a much broader range of PhDs and advanced education bases, both in physics, in biology, and of course in chemistry.
Great. And again, to go sort of one step on from that, I suppose there's another transition between understanding the science and being able to talk to the science, and then get to the point where That's Nice and sort of the broader Farmers Almanac group. You're at a point where you're now influencing discussions and almost setting trends as well as sort of responding to and being aware of them. So was there a point at which you sort of recognized that you were setting those trends?
So I remember, not to mention any names, but there was a couple of agencies that had already come into the space prior to That's Nice. And they were, maybe they'd come in about 10 years before, but they'd really more focused on marketing communications. So we found that marketing communications is typically something that's produced in-house at the marketing department side. With regards to That's Nice, we wanted to really build that strategy. So we felt what was missing for us was primary research to the biotech community. And that's actually when we started Nice Insight, which was in 2008. And that's where we actually started to do primary research on what the biotechs and pharma companies were looking for. And once we got that information, we were able to affect and influence the brands that we were building for the CDMO. So that was the pivotal moment in 2008 where that transition happened. And we've now done well over 4,000 interviews, direct interviews with pharma buyers. We've interviewed actually the top 100 pharma and biotech companies at the top-level procurement level. And also site managers, obviously all around the world there, that really do make a huge difference to the relationship between the outsourced manufacturing at CMC and the internal manufacturing, which is typically now really only mid-cap and large-cap pharma are really manufacturing their own compounds anymore. The emerging virtual and small pharma typically outsource everything to CDMOs.
So then when it comes to building teams, and I'm conscious obviously that you do run multiple companies and you have a lot of investments in the industry. So if we focus primarily on That's Nice, is there anything specific that you're looking for beyond a CV when it comes to building teams? Do you have a specific approach?
So we talk about this a lot inside the company, and I think it's a tremendously difficult question. Prior to 2020, what we had is what was referred to as a huddle culture. So we would meet regularly face to face, do a 15-minute chat, make a decision and move on, and then execute on that decision. And if it was 2, 3, sometimes 5 or 6 people, it was very short and quick. Post 2020, those decisions, that scheduling is completely different, as you know, because now working at home is now more the trend rather than in office. So when you're looking to build a team, and obviously, as you know, we work with Metric Bio to do our sourcing for That's Nice staff, is we're trying to find somebody who's first of all interested in science. So if you're not interested in science, you're probably not a good fit for That's Nice. You don't have to be a scientist, but that's a number one. 2, you're normally at the point in 2 separate groups. Either somebody in a fast learning track, where you really want to join the team, you're interested in being mentored, and you want to learn fast, and you want to be on that fast track role. And we actually have a fast track program at the company. And the second group are more in the harvesting. So they're normally 20 to 25 years in the market, and they're more like driving high-level individual contributors. And they normally mentor down the younger folk. But I would say is for the first 25 years, it was about people that want to work in small teams of 2, 4, 6. Post-COVID, we're now very much driven on, you have a very strong department head, and that department head could have anything up to 15 staff, but primarily 8 to 12, which is kind of maxes out. And then that individual is all powerful. So they go through, they identify the fast track employees that really want to make a difference, the individual contributors, and then they kind of like, they have the power of their own domain. And the most consistent department, That's Nice, that's been very loyal and very strong, is actually run by young Tay. And she's been with me now for 23 years. And that department is most stable, it's the most profitable, and it's the most loyal.
And then just to touch on because it's something that you and I have spoken about in terms of the work from home culture that I suppose post-COVID has become more prevalent. How has that then impacted on those sort of, you mentioned those hierarchical relationships and how people hire within their groups? How do you think that's impacted that hiring and then subsequently impacted the office culture?
I would say terribly. In fact, it was kind of exciting when I came to the Metric Bio Nottingham offices earlier this year, and I saw the atmosphere and the culture that we'd built for 25 years. But when you are not together, it's very difficult to build those relationships. So we do fly our staff in to the annual general meeting, which is every January. So everybody gets to meet each other, and it's from Asia, from Europe, and from North America. But it's just been hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'd say that we're still in the transition of how to work remotely. I think, as you know, obviously recruiting for us is when we put a mandate in that you must work in office, we have a limited group of responses, right? And in BD, you don't need to be in office. So for research, for publishing, for content development, for creative, account management, these are all transitions that we're going through.
And do you think, can you see a return to the sort of previous office culture that you had, or do you think this is irreversible and something that you have to adapt to and the business has to adapt to?
I would say for the next couple of years, we're definitely going to have to adapt. I mean, I have a 21-year-old this year and a 17-year-old. Son just turned 17, and they don't know, office culture. They only know remote. So I do believe is that we're going to really struggle. And I'm not talking about That's Nice, but I think younger companies that are hiring people in their 20s are really, really struggling with coming into that office setting. I think the slightly older staff, when I say older, because now I'm 55 this year, is people that are more in their 30s and 40s and 50s. They're going to transition back at some point. But I think if you go back to some of the big global tech leaders, Elon Musk, for example, listen to some of his YouTube presentations. And he just believes that whole sort of that underbelly of people coming out of college, those roles are all going to go within 3 years. 3 years. So I would really hope that we can regather and recollect that culture, that huddle culture. But I think we're a couple of years away.
Yeah. And I suppose you have a fairly unique perspective in that you have your own hiring as somebody who hires both from within industry and then hiring sort of agency professionals.
Yeah.
So if you then view it from your agency perspective looking into the CDMO industry, are there any specific trends outside of the sort of work from home culture that you've noticed? Is there anything in particular that you think people in the industry are struggling with in terms of talent needs or in terms of building coherent teams?
Yeah, and I think because obviously we work together very, very closely with some similar customers, I think when a client calls us and says, hey, we're looking for a senior BD person, I think it's a quite easy pass. It's a quite easy pass over to Metric Bio. And I feel that those individuals are fairly, let's say, easily found, not easily found as you can easily start up a Metric Bio and get it going, but as a professional group, those individuals are a real sweet spot to find because they have to be versatile, they have to be able to travel, and it doesn't really matter whether they're office-based. When you start getting into operational roles, lab roles, CMC roles, and executive management roles where you really do need to be a lot more hands-on, I see that there is a real panic going on. Travel around the world, visit 30 to 40 countries every year, go to offices, they're just empty offices. And it's the same as the That's Nice offices. We used to be like packed and, no room, bums on seats, everybody was fighting for the space. Now people are at home. And it's happening exactly that way as well. So BD, I think, is super flexible. Operations, lab services, and senior management, they do need to be together. And I think that's identical.
So then in terms of hiring for your teams, is there anything specific that you could point to in terms of a hiring mistake that you've made, and were there any learnings from that for you and the business?
Oh yes, we have made plenty of mistakes. I think we've had a total of 450 people now come through. That's nice, over nearly 31 years. Probably the biggest mistake that I would say I've personally made is that definitely a supreme optimist. So I believe that everybody's perfect, and then over time they just let me down. So, it's different than my mother, who's a pessimist, so she doesn't believe anything of anybody, and you have to earn her trust. So I think when we hire new talent, and it doesn't matter whether you're 2 years out of school or you're a 30-year vet, I feel as if we've gone through the expectations in the interviews. We've gone through expectations on onboarding. But people need guidance. Leaders need guidance. I need guidance. I mean, we've just hired 2 new C-suites at That's Nice. And they're already bringing direction to me. And they're like, you're too loosey-goosey. You're not clear on what your expectations are. And that's my new C-suites telling me that I'm making errors. So I think the entrepreneurial spirit of rowing the boat together and working out who should be the mascot at the front and who should be in the middle and who should be at the end, who's directing the rudder, that is something that you work out with the talent as they come in. But more guidance and leadership, clear understanding of what's expected from the individual is probably something that I continually make mistakes on.
And just to touch upon that then, in terms of the C-suites that you've brought in, do you think it's important that you hire people that can challenge you and ultimately then perhaps impact change in the business?
I think my staff would say absolutely. It's a bit of a challenge. We just invested in our 64th company, a company called Disarm, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm super excited with Mark Bamforth and Richard Schneider there. 2 people that I really hold in terribly high esteem, in massive respect. And to actually work alongside them is really exciting. However, my new C-suites really want to change. the way that That's Nice comes to market. So I didn't hire them to follow me. I hired them to lead me. So that's difficult, but it was needed.
Great. So difficult question.
Yeah.
If you had to define what your successor would look like at That's Nice, what would you say you or the business would need and look for?
Well, that is a difficult question. We had that transition at the end of 2019 where, I had a health issue which lasted for about 4 years, and I actually needed to find a successor because I was supposedly not to be around in 2020, which I think of maybe a few people know. Maybe you're not also aware of that as well.
I wasn't aware of that.
So, yes, I got terminal cancer, so stage 4 cancer in 2019, and actually found out on May 15th of 2019. So I actually needed to find a successor, and they gave me 5 months to live. So really the individual that I felt was best was my senior account director, Wei Gao. And we'd worked really well together and just had a great rapport. Mark and Wei and I made a lot of decisions as a group, so we chose Wei Gao. And I think as Wei took that role on, he realized that to be a senior account director, you are Mr. Popular. You make things happen. You stick everything together in the company. And Wei was definitely the most charismatic individual employee, and also is now a co-owner of That's Nice. And unfortunately, he got sick in 2024 and realized that he couldn't continue on that role. So I had to come back into that role in September of 24, and we are in the process of looking for a new CEO so that I can do what I think I do best, which is really the strategy and the client interaction. So what am I looking for? There's a little bit of a sideline you may not know. So I would say I'd love to find somebody who's in their late 30s, that is with family, has a partner, and is looking to grow the business with an 80-hour work week. And when you say that with a young family and a partner, it's tough to find. So that's the individual criteria, not somebody in their 50s that is at the point where I'm at, and not somebody who's younger, because you need that experience. You need to have failed. You need to have lost a team, grown a team, built a business, or built a business unit. So it's pretty important that the individual is tremendously driven. So if you ever do psychometric testing, they have to be, 95 to 98D, which is mildly psychotic, by the way. So, but you have to have that massive drive, as you have with your CEO, Joe Janney.
Yeah, who fits that disc profile.
I know.
Mentioned.
And when I first met you guys about 15 months ago, I was like, wow, this is a great team. And I keep complimenting you guys, but I don't do a lot of compliments in the industry. You might not know that as well. I'm not big at complimenting people, but really enjoyed meeting Joe and seeing what's going on with his vision.
And would you say that's impacted seeing Metric and seeing Joe and the way that we operate? Would you say that's impacted what you would look for in your successor?
Well, we actually talked about that, I think. When we all met together, I said, it'd be great if we can use some of the Metric Bio playbook. And I think that we are a little bit more old school. We're a bit more paper, and we're trying to get out of that. But there's a mojo, and there's a vortex that you create when you get a number of your leaders aligned. And you have that, and we're trying to get back to that.
Cool. Okay, great. I mean, that's a massive compliment to Metric, so appreciate that, and I know Joe would as well. Just to come back to, I suppose, the type of person then, would you say it's important that they have an agency background, or would you look to somebody from the industry, so from the CDMO industry, or would you say it's purely sort of personality and drive led?
So if you look at some of our competitors that are in the marketplace, they've actually gone to hire people that are not from agency. And I think that's exactly where we'll go as well. We have had a couple of candidates that we're in late stage discussion with right now, and they're not agency. They're not agency at all. They're business executives that have grown creative service companies, that they are connected to life science, but certainly not marketing companies.
Okay. And then in terms of, I suppose you've touched upon it there, but if you had to boil it down to one trait that you think every leader needs, is there something specific that you could point to?
Decisive decision making. That's it.
Okay.
Everything else is somewhat irrelevant.
Okay.
You need to be decisive, making a decision and sticking with it. If it's the wrong decision, it's fine, because you're moving forward, you can course correct. If you stay static, if you don't make a decision, you're basically quicksand. You're not moving. You can easily turn if you move forward. If you don't move, it's difficult to turn around.
Great.
So decisive decision making.
The ability to act with conviction.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. And then in terms of, I suppose, talking of leaders, talking of impactful people in the CDMO industry, if you had to recommend one person that we speak to next on this podcast, who would you recommend?
Well, that's a tough question. I think we have 188 meetings this week in 2026. So, well, there's an individual that I've known for 20 years, and he's in small molecule. He got passed over multiple times to become a general manager. He got to general manager, he got passed over as CEO, and he had an opportunity to move outside of small molecule and move into a super niche area at a much smaller company, but to take that leadership CEO role. And his name is Chris Conway. So I would say, if you can get Chris Conway to sit down with you, you will have a great time. Massive respect to Chris.
Great. Okay, cool. We'll look to get Chris on. So at the end of every show, we like to do a rapid fire short question closer. So
okay.
I guess 3 questions that I'd be interested in your response. First would be career advice. So what's the best career advice you've ever received?
Well, my father was in HR, so my dad said, continue learning. When you stop learning, make a change.
Great. Good advice. Nice. And then the next would be motivation. So you've been in the industry 30 plus years.
Yeah.
What keeps you motivated?
Meeting scientists that spend their entire career trying to improve other people's lives that they don't know is hugely motivating. One of the reasons why I feel we're still in the same space and we're still servicing the same customers after 30 years is because there's that scientist that, they're a kid, they do a PhD, they go out, they sit in a lab, nobody knows who they are. And at some point they get their name on the patent, their drug gets launched, and they're not lauded again, but they're there, and they're making the difference. My mother turns 90 this year, and I think the life expectancy of somebody born in 1936, which is obviously when she was born, was 71. That's 19 additional years because of health and medicine, the business that we serve.
Inspiring. Cool. And then final question would be in terms of anything that's influenced you recently. So is there anything particular in terms of a book or a podcast or a person that has influenced you recently?
There's an individual who had TILS medicine, a TILS process, to cure his melanoma. I had Mechanis and Teflonar, which was manufactured by Novartis, and his book I've read maybe 20 times. I haven't read any book 20 times, and I keep it on my bedside, and I look at it occasionally, and I think, people can survive cancer. So that would be an influence.
Inspiring.
Yes.
Great. All right. Appreciate that. Thanks for your time, Nigel. I know you've got a busy week.
Yeah.
So all the best for this week. Have a successful DCAT, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Well, hopefully I didn't torture you, Sam. And look forward to seeing you on the show floor.
Great.
Thanks,
Nigel.
Bye-bye.
All right.